Where did that shot come from? The SEAL team stared after a 3,247 hit. The bullet was already in the air before anyone on the ground knew a shot had been fired. That is the part that stays with people, not the distance, not the physics, not the confirmation that came days later in a classified cable nobody outside that building would ever read. What stays with people is the silence that came first, a silence so complete that the men crouching behind a blown-out wall in the middle of a burning Iraqi afternoon heard absolutely nothing before the world changed. Owen Garrett heard it secondhand. He was 31 years old, a Navy SEAL who had been in Mosul for 4 months, and he had developed the kind of patience that only comes from being afraid for a very long time without being able to show it. He was crouched behind a vehicle that had stopped being useful as a vehicle about 6 weeks ago and was now useful only as cover, watching a narrow street through the gap between a crumbled wall and a door that no longer had hinges. His team was pinned. Not critically, they had been in worse, but pinned enough that the afternoon had the shape of a problem without an obvious answer. The machine gun position 2 blocks southwest had been quiet for about 40 seconds. 40 seconds is not a long time. In ordinary life, 40 seconds is the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, check your phone, decide you don't want to read that email right now. In a firefight, 40 seconds of silence from a position that was loud 30 seconds ago is either very good news or the beginning of something much worse. Owen had learned, in the slow and expensive way that men in his profession learn things, to tell the difference between those two kinds of silence before committing to an answer. He listened, his hand was relaxed on his rifle, his breathing was steady. The silence continued. His spotter, a lean 28-year-old from Newcastle named Connor Dale, was watching the same gap through a different angle, and when Connor turned and gave Owen a look that said, "I don't know either," Owen made a decision. He raised a fist, the team froze. He waited one more beat too, and then the comms crackled and an ISF liaison's voice came through, not in clear English, but in the tone that needs no translation, the tone that sits between confusion and relief, the tone of a man describing something he cannot quite believe he saw. "Where did that shot come from?" Owen said. Nobody answered. There was no answer to give, not yet. Owen Garrett had grown up in a small town in southern England, the kind of place where the main street has a pub, a chemist, and a war memorial with too many names on it for the size of the town. His father had been in the army. His grandfather had been in the army. The Garrett men had a tradition of going to difficult places and coming home changed, and Owen had continued this tradition with a dedication that would have made his father proud and his mother permanently anxious. He had joined the Royal Marines first, then crossed over through a pipeline that does not advertise itself, and by the time he arrived in Mosul, he was the kind of operator who had stopped counting deployments not because he had lost track, but because the number had stopped feeling like useful information. What mattered was the mission in front of him, the city around him, the team beside him. The team was 6 men. Connor Dale, his closest partner, who had a habit of solving crossword puzzles on his phone in the exact same way he solved tactical problems, quietly, methodically, never asking for hints. Daniel Marsh, the team's medic, who was built like a furniture removal man and moved like a dancer, and had the softest hands Owen had ever seen on someone who could also carry 200 pounds of kit up a hillside without breathing hard. Pete Calloway, who was funny in the specific way that men become funny when they have decided that humor is the only sane response to insanity, and who had been making the same joke about the Mosul heat since the first week. The joke had not improved, but nobody had told him to stop. And 2 others, Hugh Norris, who was the youngest and tried not to show it, and Alan Price, who was the oldest and tried not to show that either. 6 men, 1 afternoon, 1 machine gun position that had just gone inexplicably quiet. Owen made another decision. He signaled the team forward. They moved, fast, low, fluid, the choreography of men who have practiced this together so many times that individual thought has been replaced by shared instinct. Connor moved left, Daniel covered the roofline. Pete and Hugh pressed the wall. Alan came last, checking the space they had just left the way a careful man checks the door he just closed. Owen reached the corner first, looked around it, and saw the 2-block stretch of open street that led to the position where the machine gun had been. The position was empty. Not empty like abandoned, empty like finished. Owen stood in the open for exactly 3 seconds, which is a long time to stand in the open, and he looked at that empty position and he felt a specific kind of confusion that he had no good word for. Something had happened here before they arrived, something conclusive, something from a direction he could not immediately identify. He brought the teams through. They cleared the position out of habit, out of training, out of the understanding that the worst outcomes in this profession usually come from assuming something is over when it is only paused. The ISF column he learned over comms had already pushed through the gap. The threat to that column, the reason his team had been redirected, the reason they had spent 45 minutes working their way through side streets toward a position they apparently no longer needed to neutralize, was gone. The afternoon, which had felt like it was building toward a crisis, had simply ended. Owen stood in the street and looked southwest, in the direction that the math, when he eventually did it, would tell him the shot had come from. He could not see the building from where he stood. At 3,247 meters, he was not going to see the building. On a rooftop in that city, 11 hours earlier, two men had settled in. One of them was called Nathan Ray. He was 34 years old, born in Coventry, raised in 3 different cities because his father worked for a company that believed relocation was a form of professional development. He had never played team sports. He had shot his first rifle at 11 in a field behind his uncle's house, and something had happened in him at the exact moment the round left the barrel, not excitement, not fear, but a very specific kind of stillness that he had been chasing in various forms ever since. He joined the army at 18. He cross-trained into special operations at 23. He had been behind a sniper rifle in one form or another for the better part of a decade. The other man was called Sam Holt. He was 30 years old, from Aberdeen, and he was the kind of person who made complicated things sound boring on purpose, because making complicated things sound boring was the way he managed not to think about how complicated they actually were. Sam was Nathan's spotter. He was also, by any reasonable measure, the reason Nathan's shots landed where they were supposed to land. A sniper and a spotter are not simply two people doing related jobs, they are a system, a single organism split between two bodies. Nathan's eye goes to the rifle, Sam's eye goes to everything else. The wind, the humidity. The temperature of the air at muzzle level and the temperature of the air at the target, and the gradient between those two temperatures. Because air is not uniform and a bullet traveling far enough will pass through layers of atmosphere that behave differently from each other. The Earth's rotation. The slight, almost imperceptible drag that the Coriolis effect exerts on a projectile over long distance. A force that matters not at all at 200 meters and matters very much at 2,000. Sam tracked all of this. He tracked it with instruments and with memory and with the practiced intuition that comes from spending more hours calculating ballistics than most people spend watching television. They had been on the roof since before dawn. The city had woken up around them. They had watched the light change. They had watched the streets below fill and empty and fill again. They had watched vehicles move and people move, and the particular movement of men who are trying to look like they are not watching something. They had communicated in the shorthand of a long partnership, a gesture, a pointed finger, a number spoken at half volume, and they had made decisions about what they were seeing and what it meant and what, if anything, they were going to do about it. Nathan's rifle was a Macmillan TAC-50. It was chambered in .50 BMG, a round originally designed for a machine gun, repurposed by engineers who had decided that if a cartridge could drive a machine gun, it could also, with the right barrel and the right conditions, reach farther than any previous military sniper round had reached in actual combat. The rifle itself weighed 12 kilograms unloaded. It was bolt action. It was built around the concept that accuracy matters more than speed, because at the distances Nathan operated, speed was irrelevant. You got one attempt. Sometimes, if you were lucky and the conditions held, you got 2, but you planned for 1. The round Nathan had loaded would leave the barrel at approximately 792 miles per hour, faster than a commercial aircraft. Faster than sound, which meant that anyone standing near the target would hear nothing from the direction of the rifle. They would hear only the impact itself, if they heard anything at all. At 3,247 meters, the bullet would be in the air for approximately 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Nathan had thought about that number many times over the years, in the abstract, in training scenarios, in the clinical language of the data sheets that described what this rifle and this round were theoretically capable of. He had thought about what it meant for a piece of metal to travel for 10 seconds through air that was not still, over ground that was not flat, in an atmosphere that was not consistent, toward a target that was not stationary. Now he was not thinking about it in the abstract. Now he was watching, through a 34mm circle of glass, a machine gun team setting up behind a crumbled wall 3,247 meters away. Sam was already reading the numbers. Wind at the muzzle 4 kilometers per hour, slightly left to right. Wind at the midpoint estimated, because you cannot measure wind at every point along a 3.2 kilometer path, probably similar. Wind at the target 6 to 7 based on the way a piece of loose fabric was moving on a building near the position. The temperature 41 degrees Celsius. The humidity low, which was favorable. The altitude difference between the roof and the target. The target was slightly lower, perhaps 8 meters of drop over that distance, which would affect trajectory in a way that had to be added to the already significant drop caused by gravity alone. Elevation plus 23, Sam said. Nathan adjusted. Wind hold left 3/4 mil. Nathan adjusted. Sam read 2 more variables. Nathan made 2 more adjustments. The rifle was now pointing at a place in the air that to any observer without context looked like nothing at all, a spot above and to the right of the target, a point in empty sky that had been calculated to intersect with where the target would be after the bullet had spent 10 seconds fighting the wind and the heat and the rotation of the earth. Nathan looked through the scope. The men behind the wall were getting ready. They had no idea they were being watched. At 3,247 meters, a man on a rooftop with a rifle is invisible, not because he is hidden, but because the distance itself provides a kind of camouflage that no amount of technology has fully solved. The human eye does not naturally search at that range. The mind does not naturally consider that kind of threat as immediate. That was what Nathan and Sam were counting on. That was what they had been counting on for 11 hours. Nathan found the intersection of crosshair and calculation. He regulated his breathing in, out, until the rhythm was slow enough that the pause between exhale and the next inhale was natural and long. His heart rate was measured. His hands were still. His world had been reduced to a circle of glass and everything inside it, and everything outside it had receded to the edge of awareness where it would stay until this was over. Sam said nothing more. He had said everything he needed to say. The rest was Nathan's. Nathan exhaled halfway, stopped, held the half-breath, found the stillness inside the stillness. And then the rifle moved. Not in the way that things move when they are being driven. In the way that things move when they have been waiting to move, when the release is the natural conclusion of everything that came before it, the 11 hours and the data and the years of training, and the quiet that 2 men can build together when they have learned to trust each other past the point where trust requires conversation. The shot left the barrel. The roof filled briefly with sound, and then the sound was gone and there was silence again, a different silence. A silence on the other side of something, and Sam was already watching through his scope, counting the way he always counted, the way he had counted on every shot they had ever taken together, because the counting was the only part of the 10 seconds that a human being could do while the physics finished its work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His breath was steady. 6, 7, 8. The city spread out below them, indifferent, enormous, full of lives that had no idea this moment was happening. 9, 10. Sam Holt did not breathe for another 3 seconds after the count. He watched. He had learned over years of doing exactly this, that the worst thing a spotter can do in the moment after a shot is to decide too quickly. The mind wants resolution. The mind wants to know immediately whether the round landed or missed, wants to close the loop and file the outcome and move on to whatever comes next. Sam had trained himself out of that impulse. He watched. He waited. He let the image in his scope tell him what had happened, rather than deciding what had happened before the image was finished forming. What he saw was this: the wall, the position behind the wall, a man standing and then not standing. Sam lowered his scope 2 centimeters, looked again, raised it back. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, confirmed, in the same tone he used to say, pass the water. Nathan was already pulling back from the rifle. Not rushing made noise, and noise at this stage was the one thing they could not afford, but moving with the efficient economy of men who have rehearsed their exit the way theater performers rehearse an exit, because in this profession, the way you leave a location is often more important than the way you arrived. The rifle came apart in Nathan's hands. The scope came off. The components went into the case in a sequence that was almost musical, each piece finding its place with a kind of practiced certainty that had nothing to do with conscious thought. Sam was already watching the streets below. Left side first, then right, then the rooftop across, then the street behind. He had a timer in his head that he had not started yet and would not start until they were moving, but the timer was already there, already counting in potential, the way a car engine runs at low idle before you ask it to go anywhere. 4 minutes, Sam said. Nathan nodded. He already knew. Owen Garrett was still standing in the empty machine gun position when the comms brought him the first partial picture. The ISF liaison, a man named Karim who spoke excellent English and had the deeply tired face of someone who had been fighting in the city for longer than anyone should have to fight in any city, came across on the channel with a location. A rooftop, southwest. He had triangulated from the angle of the O and stopped listening at the word angle and did the math himself, the rough approximation that trained instinct provides before numbers confirm it. He looked southwest. He could not see the building. How far? He asked. Karim gave a number. Owen did not respond immediately. He looked at Connor, who had been listening on the same channel, and Connor's expression was the expression of a man who has been asked to solve a math problem and has solved it and does not entirely believe the answer. That's over 3 kilometers, Connor said. I know. In this heat. I know. They looked at each other for a moment, the way men look at each other when they are both thinking the same thing and neither of them wants to say it first, because saying it out loud makes it a fact, and a fact has weight that a thought does not have. Someone had eyes on that position, Owen said. Before we did, long before we did. Connor nodded slowly. Someone calculated that shot, Owen continued, while we were still back at the briefing being told what the threat picture looked like. Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the ISF column would have gone through a kill zone. Owen said nothing. He looked at the empty position again. He looked at the small evidence of what had been here, the weight marks in the dust, the footprints, the posture of a space that had been occupied and was now not, and he thought about the ISF column rolling through the street a half-mile east, unknowing, protected by a decision made 3,247 meters away by a person whose name Owen did not know and might never know. Yeah, Owen said finally, they would have. He turned the team around. The afternoon was not over. It was never fully over in Mosul. There was always something else, always another direction to face, another set of calculations to run. Pete Calloway made a comment about the heat, the same joke, wearing it like a familiar piece of clothing, and nobody told him to stop because in the machinery of how that team managed itself, familiar things were valuable and not to be thrown away lightly. They began the process of moving back through the city. Owen kept thinking about the number. The video confirmation took 3 days. There was a drone overhead. There was almost always a drone overhead in Mosul during that period, a persistent presence that most people in the city had stopped noticing the way city dwellers stopped noticing certain sounds, and the drone's camera had captured the rooftop, the street, and the position behind the wall in a single wide frame. The analysts who reviewed the footage did the kind of work that analysts do. They measured angles, they cross-referenced timestamps, they used the shadows on the building walls to confirm the time of day and the position of the light source and a dozen other details that non-specialists would not think to look at. They came back with a distance. The first analyst who saw the number assumed she had made an error. Her name was Laura Webb, and she was 26 years old and had a mathematics degree from a university in Bristol and had been doing this work for 3 years, and she had reviewed enough footage of enough engagements to have a reasonably calibrated sense of what was possible and what was not. She redid the calculation. She got the same number. She sent it to her supervisor, a man named Philip Grant, with a note that said simply, "Please check my work on this one." Philip checked her work. He got the same number. He sent it up. It came back confirmed. 3,247 meters. The cable that went out from that building did not use the word record. It did not make any comparative claims. It described the engagement in the flat, careful language that official documentation uses when it wants to be precise and does not want to be sensational. But everyone who read it did the same thing Laura Webb had done. They read the number, they paused, and they quietly checked it against everything they knew about what was and was not physically possible. It held. In a different city, in a different country, a general read the cable. He read it twice. He put it down on his desk and picked up his coffee and drank from it without tasting it and then set it back down and looked at the cable again. He had been in military service for 31 years. He had seen things that had surprised him. The number on this cable was in a different category from all of those things. He wrote a note in the margin of the cable. It said verify independently. Then he thought about it and added again. It was verified again and again after that. The number did not change. Owen heard the confirmed figure 10 days after the shot, in a debrief that covered many things and spent only 2 minutes on this particular item. The person delivering the brief moved through it quickly, distance, method, outcome, operational impact, and then moved on because there were other items on the agenda and a confirmed extraordinary engagement, while significant, was still only one item among many. Owen was not taking notes at that moment. He was thinking. He was thinking about the ISF column. He was thinking about the machine gun position and the empty space he had found when he arrived. He was thinking about the particular feeling of walking into the aftermath of something you didn't see happen and trying to reconstruct the shape of it from the evidence left behind. He was thinking about 10 seconds. After the debrief, in the brief dead space between that room and the next thing, Connor came up beside him. "You think it was a SEAL team?" Connor asked. Owen shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter." Connor considered that. "It kind of matters." "Not to the column, it doesn't." They were both quiet for a moment. 3247, Connor said softly, "the way you repeat a number when you are trying to make it real, when the number is the kind of thing that the mind keeps sliding off of because it doesn't have a familiar shape." "Yeah," Owen said. "Who does that?" Owen thought about it. He thought about the roof. He thought about 11 hours on a roof in 41-degree heat with one chance and one outcome and the particular architecture of patience that kind of work required. He thought about what it meant to be that still for that long, for a shot that no one would announce and no one would celebrate publicly, and no one would put on a news report with graphics showing the trajectory. "Someone very good at waiting," Owen said. He went to the next thing. The machine gun position that went quiet that afternoon saved, by the military's later estimate, a significant number of lives in the ISF column that passed through the street beyond it. The estimate was careful. Military estimates in these situations are always careful because the mathematics of what might have happened is imprecise and everyone involved knows it, but the shape of the threat was clear enough. The column was exposed. The position was manned. The angle was clean. What happened instead was a quiet afternoon in Mosul. Daniel Marsh, the team medic, heard the full story later from Owen, in pieces, the way all stories get told in the field, in fragments, during gaps in the schedule, over terrible coffee in a room that smelled like generator exhaust. Daniel was the kind of person who listened to stories the way he examined injuries, carefully, without interrupting, forming his understanding before he formed his opinion. "Does it bother you?" Daniel asked when Owen had finished, not knowing who it was. Owen thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things, not quickly, not for show, but in the deliberate way of a man who had decided at some point that honest answers were worth the extra time they required. "No," he said, "honestly, no." "Why not?" "Because we don't need to know," Owen said. "The column moved, that's the whole story, everything else is just detail." Daniel nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He looked at the wall opposite him, which had a map pinned to it and a duty roster and a handwritten note in someone's terrible handwriting that Daniel had been meaning to read for a week and never had. "You know what I keep thinking about," Daniel said. "Tell me." The bullet was in the air for 10 seconds. Daniel paused. The guys in that column had no idea, going about their business, moving through the street. The shot had already been fired, the round was already on its way, and they just walked through it, completely unaware. Owen nodded. "There's something strange about that," Daniel said. "Strange how?" Daniel thought about it, like the protection was already there before they needed it. Like the decision was made for them by someone they'll never meet before the moment ever arrived. They walked through the safest stretch of road in Mosul, and they didn't even know to be grateful for it. Owen was quiet for a moment. "That's probably the best kind," he said. Nathan Ray was on a commercial flight to London when the confirmation reached the file. He did not know this at the time. He was sitting in a window seat, not looking out the window, eating something from a foil tray that he had stopped tasting about halfway through. His rifle was crated and in the hold below. His kit was in the overhead. His body was in a seat at 35,000 feet, and his mind was doing the thing it always did after an operation, which was to go through everything in sequence, not obsessively, not with anguish, but with the methodical attention of a tradesman checking his work. Had the preparation been thorough? Had the data been correct? Had the outcome matched the intention? Yes, yes, yes. He was not a man who spent much time after an engagement revisiting the engagement. He had worked with men who did that, men who carried every shot with them the way some people carry photographs, pulling them out to look at them in quiet moments. Nathan had decided early in his career that this was not a useful habit. The past, once reviewed and confirmed and filed, was best left where it was. The job required presence. Presence required a mind that was not cluttered with its own history. But he did think about Sam. He and Sam Holt had been a team for 6 years. 6 years was long enough that the professional and personal had become indistinguishable in the way that all close working partnerships eventually blur. Nathan knew that Sam took his tea with no milk and 2 sugars, which was objectively wrong. Sam knew that Nathan had a habit of tapping his left forefinger against whatever surface was nearest when he was thinking hard, a habit Nathan himself was entirely unaware of until Sam pointed it out in the 2nd year of their partnership. Nathan knew that Sam called his mother every Sunday without exception, and Sam knew that Nathan had not spoken to his own father in 4 years and had decided, with the kind of quiet finality that Nathan brought to all decisions, that 4 years was about right. They did not discuss personal things very often. They did not need to. 6 years of proximity creates a kind of understanding that conversation is inefficient at producing. What Nathan was thinking about in the window seat over the Alps was the 10 seconds. He was not thinking about the shot itself. He was not thinking about the distance or the calculation or the outcome. He was thinking about the 10 seconds between when the trigger released and when Sam said confirmed, the 10 seconds during which the question was open, during which all the preparation and all the calculation and all the years of practice were simply done, simply complete, and the only remaining actor was the physics. Nathan had no control over those 10 seconds. The round was out of his hands. The situation was no longer a problem he could solve or a decision he could make. It was a process that either would or would not arrive at the intended conclusion, and his involvement in that process had ended. Most people Nathan had found did not like that feeling. He had come to find it peaceful. Sam Holt landed in Aberdeen 12 hours before Nathan landed in London. His mother met him at the arrival's gate, which she always did, which Nathan had always found touching, and which Sam accepted as simply how things worked. Sam's mother was a small, practical woman named Helen who had been a nurse for 32 years and had the effect on most people of making whatever you were worried about seem manageable. She looked at Sam the way she always looked at him when he came back from somewhere he couldn't tell her about, with a complete inventory, from his shoes to the top of his head, in about 2 seconds, and then she hugged him briefly and said, "You look thin," and asked if he wanted fish and chips or a proper meal. He said a proper meal. They drove to her house in the kind of comfortable silence that people share when they have run out of things to fear about each other. The city outside the window was gray and damp, and exactly as Sam had left it, which was the thing he loved most about it. Cities that change while you are away have a way of making you feel like a visitor in your own life. Aberdeen, in his experience, did not change faster than he could keep up with. He did not tell his mother what had happened in Mosul. He never told her what happened anywhere. She never asked. This had been their arrangement since he was 22 and had told her then that the work he was going to do was the kind of work that was better not discussed, and she had looked at him steadily and said, "All right, as long as you come home." And they had both understood that this was an agreement about what information would flow between them rather than an agreement about what he would or would not do. He came home, that was the part that mattered. Over dinner, she told him about her neighbor's new dog and a planning dispute on the high street and the fact that his cousin Gary had gotten a promotion at his company and seemed very pleased about it. Sam listened to all of this with genuine attention. This was not the performance of listening that people sometimes do when they are waiting for their turn to speak. He was actually listening. He was interested. The granular texture of a life being quietly and competently lived was interesting to him in a way that he had never been able to fully explain and had stopped trying to explain. Later, doing the dishes she washed, he dried, as always, she said, without looking up from the sink, "Are you all right?" Sam thought about it. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She nodded. She handed him a plate. He dried it. "Good," she said, and that was the whole conversation. In a building in Ottawa, a senior communications officer named Richard Fenn was writing a statement. The statement was 44 words long when he finished it. He had started with 112 and removed everything that was not strictly necessary, the way a sculptor removes everything that is not the statue. He had removed language that implied pride because the statement was not meant to express pride. He had removed language that implied regret because there was none to express. He had removed anything that could be used to narrow the location, the timing, the method, the identity of the person involved. What remained were 44 words that confirmed a distance and an outcome and an operational effect and nothing else. He read it twice, he sent it up. The decision about whether to release it was made 2 floors above him by people whose considerations were broader than his. They thought about the record. They thought about what the record meant for the public's understanding of what Canadian Special Forces could do. They thought about the previous record, which had been British, and the record before that, which had also been British, and the record before that, which had been Canadian, and the pattern that this history described. A competition that was not officially a competition among allies who were not officially competing, for a number that nobody officially tracked, but that everyone in the relevant communities tracked very carefully. They thought about Craig Harrison, the British sniper who had held the record until now, who had been named publicly against his wishes, who had received threats serious enough to require changes in how he lived his life, whose family had experienced consequences they had done nothing to invite. They thought about Nathan Ray and decided that Nathan Ray did not need to be Craig Harrison. The statement went out unnamed. It landed in newsrooms around the world with the gentle impact of a very specific kind of extraordinary thing, the kind that people understand rationally is remarkable but have no emotional framework for, because nothing in ordinary experience provides a reference point for 3,247 meters. Journalists wrote about it in terms of athletic achievements, comparing it to world records in track events, because that was the nearest familiar category. Some of them got the physics approximately right. Some of them explained the effect of the Earth's rotation in ways that were approximately wrong. All of them struggled with the same problem, which was that there was no photograph and no name and no footage that could be released, and a story without those things is harder to land than a bullet in still air. The story ran for a few days, then it receded. This was expected, this was fine. What did not recede was the number itself, which entered the quiet oral history of a community that keeps its records in memory rather than on paper. Among snipers and spotters, among the trainers who run the courses and the evaluators who grade them, and the retired operators who consult on doctrine and equipment, the number was discussed with the specific quality of attention that extraordinary things receive from people who understand exactly what makes them extraordinary. The distance, the conditions, the heat, the wind, the fact that the rifle's own manufacturer listed its effective range at 1,800 meters and the round had traveled nearly twice that. The 10 seconds. Every person in that community who heard the number thought about the 10 seconds. They thought about what it would mean to release a round and then wait. To have done everything possible and then to be required by the simple structure of physics to wait while your outcome finished arriving. To hold stillness not because you are patient, but because patience has long since become indistinguishable from who you are. Most of them, when they were honest with themselves, were not sure they could do it. That uncertainty was its own form of respect. Owen Garrett finished his rotation in Mosul 2 weeks after the shot. He came back to a house in Portsmouth where his wife, a woman named Claire who worked as a secondary school teacher and had the most effective bullshit detector of anyone he had ever met, had kept the garden alive in his absence, which was the thing she always did while he was gone, kept the garden alive, and it had taken Owen years to understand that this was not simply a domestic activity but a form of correspondence, a way of saying things are still growing here. The normal things are still happening, come back to them. He came back to them. He spent the first 3 days doing nothing in particular. He slept in a bed that was soft in a way that took adjusting to. He ate food that tasted of intention rather than logistics. He sat in the garden in the evenings and watched the light change in a sky that had no operationally relevant features, and he let his mind be quiet the way it could only be quiet in places where nobody needed anything from it. On the 4th day, he went for a run. On the 5th day, he fixed the back gate, which had been sticking since before he left. On the 6th day, he drove to his parents' house for Sunday dinner and sat at a table that had accommodated every version of him since childhood and let his mother ask questions. He answered carefully and let his father talk about cricket and let the ordinary weight of an ordinary family occasion settle around him like something he had been briefly but significantly out of range of. At some point that evening, his father, who was 70 and had been in the Navy 30 years ago and did not ask specific questions about specific things, looked at Owen across the table with the look of a man taking stock. "Good," he said, "just that." "Good," Owen said. His father nodded and turned back to his dinner, satisfied, and they did not speak about it again. Nathan Ray and Sam Holt were paired together for another 2 years after Mosul. They operated in locations that cannot be named, in conditions that cannot be described, under classifications that will not be lifted in either of their lifetimes. They did the work. They came back. They debriefed, they trained, they rested, they went again. The record they set on that rooftop in Mosul was surpassed in 2023 by a man named Vyacheslav Kowalski, a 58-year-old former businessman from Ukraine who had taken up a rifle in the defense of his country, and in November of that year, fired a round from a Ukrainian-made rifle called the Volodar Obryu across 3,800 meters of occupied territory and struck his target. The community of people who track these things updated their quiet record. Nathan, when he eventually heard about it through the channels through which such information travels, did not feel what people who heard the story secondhand sometimes assumed he would feel. He did not feel diminished. He did not feel competitive. He felt genuinely and without effort the specific respect that one craftsman feels for another who has done extraordinary work in terrible circumstances. He felt, if anything, solidarity. Kowalski was a civilian who became a soldier because his country required it of him, fighting at an age when most men are thinking about retirement, using a rifle that had barely been introduced to the field. The conditions under which he made his shot were different from the conditions in Mosul, but the fundamental arithmetic was the same: preparation, calculation, stillness, release, and then the wait. The same 10 seconds, extended by 800 meters. Nason's thought about that for a while. He thought about what it meant that the record had moved, that it had moved not within the elite special operations community where these things were expected to happen, but outward to an ordinary man in an extraordinary situation, doing something that the record books had previously reserved for professionals. He thought it probably said something about what people were capable of when the reasons were sufficient. He thought this and he filed it and he moved on. Somewhere in Mosul, in a street that has been cleared and rebuilt and changed and cleared again, there is a section of wall that still shows the marks of a conflict that lasted for years and touched everything it encountered. The wall does not know what happened nearby on a summer afternoon in the middle of that conflict. The wall is just a wall. But the ISF soldiers who moved through that street on that afternoon came home to families. Some of them continued to serve. Some of them left the military and went back to jobs and lives that the war had interrupted. Some of them became mechanics or teachers or farmers or shopkeepers, doing the things that people do when the emergency is over and the ordinary business of living resumes. None of them knew about the shot. None of them knew that 2 men had spent 11 hours on a rooftop for them. None of them knew about the calculation, the wind, the temperature, the adjustment for the Earth's own spin. None of them knew about the 10 seconds. They moved through the street, they reached the objective, they went home. That was the whole story. Everything else was detail. And the detail was extraordinary.